Witness. He had given up actual sleep weeks before. When he closed his eyes, it was not rest he received, nor even the comfortable unreality of dreams. There was another place that he existed, a dismal, haunted place where no sane soul was meant to tread. This place was as real as the cold little room he inhabited, with its creaky old bed and scarred wooden nightstand. Even as this other world repelled and terrified him, he was drawn to it in the hope of seeing the girl again. He pushed back the one sheet that had survived his thrashing and stood. A desperate and sick man looked back at him from the mirror on the wall. Short brown hair slicked back with sweat, wild eyes, and pallid skin. Bones pushed against his skin, giving him the appearance of someone engaged in starvation. He couldn't recall the last meal he had eaten. His appetite was touchy, destroyed at the least provocation. Lance's own reflection depressed him, a reminder that his life had become the girl and her plight. He lay back down, his fear only a passing interest compared to what waited for him on the other side of sleep. Somewhere, she waited. It always began the same way. Lying down, he would wait for sleep to claim him. How many times before he learned that it would not come? Never, it seemed. Sleep would attempt to collect its rightful victim, but just as Lance would slip away into the warm, safe between that is not sleep or wakefulness, he would hear the girl's gasp. Opening his eyes, he would find himself in another place, a witness to her terror. It shocked him to open his eyes, expecting to see the same old white ceiling, so familiar in its plainness, and instead see the striking figure of the girl. She was all innocence and subtle beauty, her hands bound and held above her head, the balls of her feet barely touching the cold stone floor. She did not stir, not a muscle twitched with a discomfort or a toe arched to escape the cold. So perfectly still was she that she could have been dead, except for her eyes. Their warmth reached across the room to where Lance sat, making his face feel hot and his heart beat rapidly. Her eyes asked the same question of him that they always did. Why? Lance never answered. His tongue was as bound as her hands, and even if he were able to speak, he did not know the answer. His body ignored all commands to get up and free her, though he could see no restraints binding him. It was as if his body were cut off from his brain. Commands were issued, but never received. Something was lost in the translation, and Lance was powerless to save her from the horde that would be joining them all too soon. So he watched and waited. The scene remained the same as the times before. The girl, bound and held hostage. Lance as witness, forever watching and never doing. The room was unchanged, perfect in its dreariness. It was cold and damp, smelling only of mold and rot. Gray stone walls and floor, lacking any windows or doors. The only illumination came from rows of candles set back into the walls. They gave off no heat, Long, dancing shadows formed and disappeared where they should have been nothing. No other features decorated the smooth blankness of the room. All very dull so as not to take any attention away from the spectacle. Lance could do nothing to help the girl, so he took to memorizing her. If he could not be saved from the coming horror, could she not be preserved, if only in his memory? Her eyes were hypnotic, her body captivating. The delicate lines of her throat, the arches of her feet, the curve of her brow, all beckoned Lance to look at them. She was naked except for the straps that held her delicate wrists. Her skin was creamy white, flawless. The palest pink colored her cheeks and lips. So young. She could not have been older than 16. Not one mole or scar dared mar her perfect beauty. Like a newborn baby, having never spilled a single drop of her blood, she held no fear. Then the horror began. Lance had no conception of its origins. One moment he was alone with the girl, feeling unbearable desperation and longing. The next moment the monster was in the room, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold. It wore a long, multicolored coat made from cats. Calicos, Siamese, tabbies, all sewn together haphazardly with black, white, and orange cats, big cats and small, long-haired and short. Lance could not tell if the coat consisted of skins or the whole animal. Heads, tails, and feet were intact. The sight dizzied him with its hypnotic intertwinement. Did they move? Was that purring he heard, screeching, hissing? Finally, he looked away, knowing that to look was to step into insanity. The monster paid no attention to Lance, but moved directly to the girl. Her innocence and stillness were simultaneously shattered. Breath exploded from her in a gasp. Her feet kicked, but were unable to find purchase on the slick stone. Toes only grazing the ground. Hectic color bloomed in her face, and her eyes widened in panic as she twisted around, trying to free her wrists. Lance's heart began to beat harder, threatening to burst from his chest and take flight. His mouth worked, but no sound escaped the trap that was his tongue and teeth. The girl was tiring quickly of her ineffective struggle. In exhaustion, she stopped and again was still, only her eyes betraying her terror. She looked to Lance again, the perpetual question in her eyes and now on her lips. Her mouth worked frantically, perfectly white teeth flashing, attempting to get some message across. But no words reached Lance's ears, only the sounds of her ragged breathing. The monster began its work. Lifting a nail-studded whip, its face cracked open in a demonic smile. The whip fell, landing hard on the girl's beautiful white skin. Lance glimpsed the monster's face for one awful second. What he saw was fuel enough for nightmares to last a lifetime. A slowly churning mass of flesh without eyes, nose, or ears. The smiling mouth was soon swallowed in the mess, only to reappear in part on the other side of its head. Lance squeezed his eyes shut. His ears could not do the same or were filled with the sounds of pain. The girl's screams of agony, her blood hitting the floor, and the thick whack of the whip hitting flesh. It was without end, this torture. Lance could still see her eyes pleading with him. If only he could move. It was no use. Struggle as he might, his limbs remained frozen. The monster began to breathe raggedly with effort. The cats hissed and spat at each other, carrying on their own private quarrel. Lance wasn't sure how long his eyes had been open. Awareness came to him, and he realized that he had been staring at the girl. Her hair was red in tangles. Tears mingled with blood and saliva, painting her face into a mask of pain. Still, her clear brown eyes looked at him. "Why?" they asked. The monster stood to the side, gaining strength for what had to be the final onslaught. Unable to take more, Lance threw up and opened his eyes to see the familiar white ceiling of his room. The day dragged by slowly with nothing to do but worry and stare out the window. He thought of the girl endlessly. Where was she now? Did she have a life away from the hell they shared? Cars sped by on the street outside, but Lance had forgotten what it was to belong to that tribe. There was only himself now, no room for the rest of the world. The people going about their business frightened him. Their faces were masks of emotion, pain, happiness, anger. What did they know of these things? Had they lived the nightmare that he lived? Had they seen the monster? If they had, they would never be so confident and free. At times he wished that he could be like them. Run from this haunted room and the girl. Forget them. As much as he wished, he knew that it was impossible to escape. That he belonged to the girl as she belonged to him. Darkness found him lying on the bed, waiting. Somewhere inside him, where light never touched, he was looking forward to seeing the girl again. He missed her. Before he fell into that other place, he always imagined her speaking to him, how her voice would sound, her laughter. To know her away from the room, to see her beauty in the light of day. How wonderful she must be, how pure and innocent. He wanted nothing more than to look upon her, to hear her thoughts and laughter. Unfortunately, his fantasies always ended with her screams. This time, Lance promised himself, I'm going to do something. I'm going to save her. Again. Hell. The girl was bound, hands above head, feet barely scraping the floor. Her eyes looked at him and it's through him. The tranquility on her face bothered Lance more than the terror. How could she be so unaware of her fate? The monster with the coat of cats arrived. One gnarled and hairy hand held a mallet with thorns attached to the head. Ignoring Lance, it moved straight to the girl, floating across the stone floor. Lance looked down to see its feet, but its coat hung to the floor. At the bottom, a dirty white cat was struggling to catch its claws on the floor, eyes rolling in terror. Thick white foam flew from its mouth as its jaws snapped shut on empty air. Another cat turned on it and waged a vicious howling attack. Lance looked back at the girl. He wanted to give her a signal that he was going to try to help her, but her eyes were wide and vacant. The monster didn't seem to care whether or not its victim was lucid. It began its work. And so did Lance. He struggled at his invisible bonds ferociously, using every ounce of strength he possessed. Blood spray filled the cold air. The girl's lack of emotion was short-lived. She drew in a deep breath and began to scream. The mallet was a ruthless weapon. The sound of crunching bone was audible, sickening. Impossibly, the girl held on to life, even as it slipped further from recovery. Dizziness overcame Lance. Conflicting emotions were welling inside him, making him ill. He knew it was useless to fight any longer. She was certain to die again. Lance threw up. his eyes, traitors, stubbornly settling back on the girl. Once captured, he could not close his eyes on her radiance. Even as blood flowed from wounds too numerous to count, he had to look. Just to see her there was unbearable. The red sheen of wet blood covered her from head to foot, contrasting with flashes of visible bone. Later, Lance was never sure if that was what had freed him for his role as witness. That unforeseen look, that one glance upon ruined beauty. Before he knew it, he was up and moving across the chamber with murderous intent. The girl's body was beaten beyond any hope of repair. But he could still put a stop to the monstrous evil that masqueraded as the creature. Put a stop to it or die trying. Either way, ending this game. It never occurred to Lance that death was not an option. Grasping the monster, Lance pulled it around to face him. Cats bit his hands, drawing blood with needle teeth. Their claws caught his shirt, attempting to pull him into their folds. Lance ignored them, his mind set on the monster. It turned easily, its grotesque head coming into view. Larger than life, the seething mass of flesh that was its face began to slide off and vanish. It discarded its loathsome disguise to show its true face. Lance stared. His mouth gaped, but the scream would not come out. "Free," the girl sang, her beauty dazzling. Her laughter rang in the chamber, a laughter that Lance had longed to hear but now covered him. It sounded so much like screaming. Lance and his newly acquired coat of seething, spitting cats approached the naked body bound up in the center of the chamber. He had a single purpose, which was to destroy. And he had the tools to do it. When he reached the young man, his own eyes looked back at him in terror. He smiled and raised the nail-studded whip. Time to begin his work. Behind him, the beautiful blonde witness clapped her hands with delight.